Today we have another Things Hidden podcast. We have Shannon Braswell from brightnews.com and Shane Kennedy. How you doing, guys?
Doing great, David. Thank you for having me.
We're all right. Yeah.
Now Shane is a man on his own island, so we got to figure out a news. Do you have a news outlet you want to promote, Shane, or anything like that?
Just a neighbor's choice and Bright News.
Oh, that's sweet, man. I can tell Lent is working in your heart.
It is.
You just, good Lord, coming out like that, strong like that. That's good. Well, today we're going to talk about, speaking of loving our neighbor, the January 6th event, is in the news again because of Tucker Carlson and his footage that he's released on Monday. Now, apparently, as of today, he was supposed to release more footage. This is the rumor, but Murdoch or somebody put a stop to it. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's some rumors that, they held back on the footage. Now, they were supposed to release all the thousands of hours of tapes, but so far they've just given a limited access to Tucker Carlson's producers, who had a limited window to be able to go into the federal building, wherever it was, and watch it. And they were given a limited window to be able to have access to it, which makes you wonder why they have it such a, Fort Knox-like situation for that footage. And why can't they just make good on their promises to release all of the footage to the public for them to make the determination? But this has created quite a stir. Shannon, you've covered it on Bright News. You talked about different factors, anything that, details that we need to include, because I haven't watched the Tucker segment. I just saw a few little clips of the Buffalo guy walking around, looked like he was getting a tour, he was a VIP getting a tour of every little spot in the Capitol building by the police, Capitol Police. What is the establishment's answer as to why they were doing that? Have they given an answer?
Not that I know of. I mean, there's nothing that's been said of, why they allowed that, or, there hasn't been a response. But, you're talking about the QAnon shaman, right? And his real name is Jacob Chansley or Jacob Charsley or something like that. So he's been sentenced to 4 yeyears in prison.
How many?
And, 4 years.
Yeah.
And he, in the footage, you'll see there's, 2 security guards walking him around, and they're checking the doors. I don't really know if it boils down to they were taking him on a tour, or if they were just kind of walking around with him, to see if making sure the doors were locked or something like that. But, anyways, they're giving him, they gave him 4 years, and he's a former Navy, former military guy.
Yeah.
And, the footage didn't seem, like he was really doing much of anything. In fact, he went into the, I think one of the chambers, and he had prayed for the officers that had let him in, and so, it makes you wonder, what is it that they're so worried about trying to hide? You have Chuck Schumer, who's, saying that, these tapes shouldn't be, or that Tucker Carlson should, take back some of the things he said, should not be allowed to air those videos. I think there's something like 40,000 minutes or something like that of videos of things that weren't aired. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different narrative than the one that we got a year ago.
And Ray Epps apparently is caught in a lie on his sworn testimony before the January 6th committee, where he was still on the property or premises long after he had said he was not. And then there was something else about, they doctored footage of Josh Hawley. Remember, they had a former ABC TV news TV entertainment producer produced the January 6th committee. If that isn't a tell to a, I don't know what a low info audience needs to hear to start saying, ooh, maybe I'm getting a production here. Why, if you're a fervent hater of everybody who's ever MAGA, at what point in that sentient brain do you start to say, dear God, why are they putting a television entertainment producer to make a committee hearing? For God's sake, this guy, it wasn't just a news producer. The guy was an ABC entertainment producer. He makes television entertaining for a living. Why you need to bring him in to produce the January 6th committee hearings, I have no idea. What sentience would start to say, good Lord, this can't be needed. These guys are just monsters. Just show the footage. They're monsters. Why do we need an ABC entertainment TV producer to produce these hearings on television? But they apparently they cut Josh Hawley, made it look like Josh Hawley was running for his life after he had questioned the sacredness of the election. And then they found out that he was like one of the last people to leave the chamber, but it made it look like, they had selectively edited it to make it look like he was running for his life and, in a unique way, when he was one of the last people to leave that particular room or whatever that he was in. So, I haven't paid attention to the particular details, but the general narrative seems to be that this starts to change the focus. Problem with this stuff is just like with what's coming out with the COVID thing and the origin of this virus and the efficacy of these products that were supposed to be sacred and the attack on early treatments. It seems like the public, there's always a 2 to 3 year lag before the general majority of the public starts to process the fact that the next biggest psychological operation was a fraud, And it seems like every time they catch up in that 3 year lag, the new institutional programs and corruption and tyranny has already been well built into the government. Like, Pelosi has used that incident to create the precedent of having armed, all this fortress around the DC area. They've used that to expand the Capitol Police to have a branch in every state, after what they did as a reward for them chaperoning these people and opening the doors and, hey, and here's where this is, and make sure you put your face there to get the photo and the cameras and everything. So they're getting all of this institutional power, but 3 years later or so is about the time that the public starts to process, oh yeah, wow, this wasn't what it was, what they told us it was.
Right. I mean, and not only that, it's like, what about that cop who they said died? I think his name is Brian, something like that.
Yeah, Brian Sicknick.
Yeah, Brian Sicknick. There was footage of him actually walking around, like escorting the people, telling them to move along and stuff like that. There, you didn't see any running or trampling of anything, and he was standing right there next to like one of the statues, one of the presidential statues, moving around signs and all of that. And so it just makes you wonder, like, was this all kind of like a hyperbole? You know what I mean? Like, there are people that need to pay for this day, because they trampled on sacred ground, the holy of holies, right? So, to me, I think really, I mean, with this guy, the QAnon guy, right? The QAnon shaman, right? That looks like, to me, it's like they're using him as a scapegoat, right? And of course, as the symbol of a deterrent, what I mean, which the law usually does, right? When they sentence somebody, whether they sentence them to death or they sentence them to a number of years in prison, they use it as a deterrent to say, okay, if you do this thing, this is what's going to happen to you, So, even though to me, it doesn't seem like he didn't think wrong, apart from his appearance, which, was kind of, very expressive. He's got a buffalo hat on, carrying around a flag with a spear on it, he's trying to stand out, you know what I mean, amongst the crowd. But you know, I mean, who doesn't do that sometimes? You know what I mean? We all want to stand out, you know what I mean? And he was just, I think he was just trying to, you know, make his voice be heard. And you know, when you take particular segments, and this is not, you know, this is not the first time the media has done this. You know what I mean? Like, you know, I remember me and Shane were talking about what had happened with like Ron DeSantis had a panel on, and that, you know, talking about how you know, like big media corporations, they like to take segments that they can run with that work for them. And even though that's not the whole story, and somebody might say, well, that's not exactly what happened. They'll say, well, we already ran it. You know what I mean? And we're going with this story, right? And so you create this trail where it's not even a trail. Like, you create this story, you know, this you know, story to, you know, amongst the American population, where once they get that story, it's hard to retract, right? And you know, people are already fixated on the fact that this was an insurrection, you know, it was a riot, you know, so that's what's running through people's heads. And because there's video footage, right, that can sort of, I guess, be you know, act as a counter argument to that. You know, now you have you know, senators and congressmen who, you know, I think they're doing everything they can to try and you know, clean up their story. You know, so you know, you know, that's what you have, I think, going on right now. You know, how can Chuck Schumer you know, clean up the story that was first laid out last year, you know, or the year before that?
And of course, I on radio leading up to January 6th, when it was happening, I was telling people on radio, I don't have a good feeling about this. This isn't a good idea, because I understand Soren Kierkegaard when he says the crowd is a lie, and you don't mix the truth with a lie. You know, it doesn't mean that you can never allow a crowd to join you in a church service or something. But the point is that, you know, whenever you see I thought that it was too quiet. They kept putting Trump and Sidney Powell and these folks on TV every night, letting them air their grievances. And the media was just too quiet. They'd say, oh yeah, this is nonsense. But they didn't really have a big boom response, you know? And I kept wondering what, you know, that's not how the media works. That's not how our government works. They always come out with some grandstanding, you know, big narrative switch. Yeah. That's usually their gimmick. And I was like, they just keep playing these people's grievances about attacking this election, and they're just too quiet. And they kept saying, oh yeah, there's January 6th games coming up. I'm like, this just doesn't, it feels like when the tide recedes, you know, before a tsunami or something, you know, if something comes out and you just, this doesn't feel right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's too quiet. And I was telling people this is not a good idea, because the spirit of the crowd is a fiery thing. And when you rev people up and tell people your election has been, you know, taken away and all this stuff, we got to be careful how we even talk about this, because those book burning fascists on some of these platforms will come after us for even daring to mention. We can talk about 2000 being stolen all day long, and those fascists will drool with joy.
Or even 2016.
Yeah, talk about 2016 was hacked. That hit any bots' ears right there? 2016 was hacked by the Russians. That probably just boosted us on the algorithm.
Yeah. The bots say, I agree.
Those little AI said, I agree, you know? And, you know, they get you. We're going to be getting Lex Friedman level algorithm support if we keep saying 2016 election was hacked by the Russians. But anyways, but my point, I guess, is just that I felt there was a deep concern about that, because you can't rev people up and say something is deeply stolen from you in this way, and then tell them to come to the doorsteps of the Capitol. This is the city which pioneers and has refined meticulously how to do insurrection, chaos, regime change around the world. They've pioneered how to do color revolutions. They pioneer how to trigger animosity between groups and to inflame ethnic divisions in countries all over the world. That city is the experts on that. Those are the experts, and the world-class experts for that. And so why would you get them all steamed up in front of the building of all these things, and then all that energy is charged up and there's no discharge? Right? Where's this discharge going to happen in a healthy way? That's only going to result in a point where people are going to get all revved up, and then they're going to be easily incited to do violence based on stupid people, based on ignorant people, and based on people with violent intentions, all mixed in with a very large crowd. That is a passion that is evil, and it has nothing to do with, in my opinion, pursuing the truth,
Yeah. I don't know, Shane, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think January 6th has become a Rorschach test for whatever people believe the truth to be. I think one thing is clear is that what the January 6th committee, edited and produced and put out to the public, that was a compilation of all the footage from January 6th that would depict violence, and that would be able to be used to argue the case that this was a violent attempt to overthrow our democracy. And now what we're seeing are the best pieces of footage that were suppressed back then by the January 6th committee that have now been released, and now these are being cherry picked the way that the January 6th committee cherry picked their pieces of footage that they released. Now Tucker is cherry picking footage to release to make it look like a Broadway musical, and the problem is that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Like this was not a 9/11 level or Pearl Harbor level attack on the country. At the same time, this was not a Broadway musical where everybody was just enjoying themselves. And I mean, there was property damage that happened. There were people that were injured, and trespass did happen.
It was Pearl Harbor level in the sense that FDR, kept that Navy nice and conveniently right there in that area when he knew there was a probability of attack, just like they stood down the National Guard and other things,
Yeah.
There was a little bit of there, but
yeah, I guess,
but not in terms of their actual violence.
Yeah, but I guess look at compare property damage, compare body counts, compare all those kind of things. And this was nothing like those. Heck, this was nothing like the riots of 2020, as far as damage and body counts go.
But it was on that level from a symbolic standpoint, actually, I think. Visually.
Well, and David,
you see what I mean? Actually, I'm thinking about it. I'm like, it kind of was from DC standpoint. It was on level with one of those big events symbolically.
But that's the ironic thing to me, though, is they keep calling it the People's House, the People's House, the People's House. That would imply that the people own it somehow, or that the people entering it would not be trespassing. Well, this is not. They need to stop calling it the People's House. This is the house that the officials that run the country occupy or use to make decisions about how to craft laws and stuff. This is it's many things, but it's not the People's House. And when they use that phrase to refer to the Capitol, they're almost making it sound like it's they're making it sound like, oh, this is an open place for anybody to come to at any time of the day.
Yeah, it's a sanctuary.
But people trespassed
right
on their house. This was not the people. They need to stop calling it the People's House. This is the Capitol. This is the the center of democracy, whatever. But it's not. This is not the people's house. In the same way, we wouldn't call the White House the people's house. We wouldn't call the Supreme Court the people's court. This is the Capitol building. It's not the people's house.
But it is, and on the symbolic way, the reason why it is on level with those events for DC is because you can never get that image. This is the Capitol, which considers itself to be the messianic heart of the world. This is the beating heart of the Messiah of the world. The United States government believes its role is to burden the world, is to hold the world's burdens on its back, and make sure that the oligarchs that own the United States make as much money in the process. It is a very symbolically visceral and violent image for DC's perspective, because they are the indispensable nation in their mind, and they are the ones to decide who runs Libya, who runs Yugoslavia, right? Who runs Egypt, who runs Afghanistan, and how are their government's elections going to be determined? They're the ones that have the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA group, and they're the ones that pick and choose which parties and which values are to be heralded as sacred and democratic around the world. And to have a visual where people with, that did not, people of all walks of life looking like ragtag, protesters are just spilling into that building unauthorized. You can't unsee that. And DC really took a hit in allowing that thing to happen like that. They had taken down the barricades. There were signs saying don't go. They removed those. They had folks like Ray Epps, who's still by the New York Times standards considered to be one of the greatest saints in the recent history.
Yeah. He's the greatest American that ever lived.
And he's over there saying, please go in that building tomorrow. Please, whatever you do. He doesn't have any time to see Trump. He flies all the way from Arizona to see Trump with his son. Doesn't have any time to see him. The whole time he's speaking, he's over there. Please go in that building the whole morning. Please go in that building. And Liz Cheney and the other little Adam Kinzinger oligarch-owned neocons, they're over there saying, "Oh, this guy is a wonderful guy. You guys have painted him to be a horrible person, but he's wonderful, wonderful guy." But he's over there telling people go in there. So they had a lot of things. This was what I call DC Aikido, where you've got the crowd revved up. And you just gotta, when they punch through, you gotta just guide that hand until it slaps them in the face, and then take the photos, the videos and everything. And that's what they did. And then it's a great event. But the problem is it costs DC more than they probably realized, right? Because it does ruin the sacredness of the aura of that building being the final decider for which governments are legitimate and illegitimate, when it even itself is getting ran over by a maddened mob. That takes it down a notch in terms of its, you see what I mean? In terms of its power and like this grandeur. In terms of it's on a primitive level, when there's a bunch of people in the class and they see the teacher just got punched, even if the teacher kind of allowed that to happen, because kind of walks right up into the frothing mouth, angry student and says, he puts his face right up on the student's face and says, don't punch me, don't punch me. And he punches him. You can't get that out of your sight. And now China, Russia, India, everybody knows that visually. And that takes them down a notch.
Yeah. I mean, it's the desecration of the most sacred temple, right? You have desecrated the Holy of Holies, right? Now, it was okay to do that, say, in some place like Oregon, right? It was okay to do that in Seattle, right? It was okay to do that in Florida, right? But so you can you can mess up all the local temples, or all the the state temples, but to do that to the Capitol, to do that in the Capitol is like sacrilege. Chuck Schumer says this is the worst attack we've seen on American. I think he said something like it's the worst attack we've seen on American democracy since the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, of course, again, I think that's hyperbole, right? but it's that, you know, trying to create that image that like this is the most this is the most unsacred thing you could do to the most sacred place in our nation, right? And so that, you know, even though it's called the people's house, right, the idea of it being the people's house is that you should revere it so much because it is your home, because it is the place where we do all of our, you know, where we carry out all our sacred rites, you know.
And what is sacred? Sacredness, from an anthropological standpoint, means that which determines who is allowed to be sacrificed and who is not.
Right. So
and that's what
QAnon
they're.
shaman.
What?
So
What's that?
so the QAnon shaman had to be sacrificed. You know,
But the point is that the reason why the reason why the Trump movement was not authorized to do that protest is, one, the Trump movement comes in the name of differentiation and boundaries, which is the deepest heresy you can have in victimism and globalism. And so the Trump movement comes in the name of a false god. And it's like bringing in a false idol into the temple. You don't do that. You don't come in the banner of a false god that has been rejected as a blasphemer and a heretic. And so by coming in the name of the false standard, their sacred aura of the mob is rejected. Like, you know, in that story where Yahweh rejects the wrong fire, you know, that's called strange fire. You know, you keep that fire out. That ain't the fire we're taking in this temple. They are okay with people, you know, they were burning the streets and doing all kinds of things when Trump was inaugurated. And all of those people, by the way, except for like one, got off completely. Did you know that? It was like 200 people arrested. Every one of them got off because they had an authorized protest, right? They were coming in the proper name. They were coming into the proper deities of victimism, of attacks against undifferentiation. And those are sacred and holy causes that DC holds very true to its heart. And they have no problem unleashing the violence of the mob to let the people know that those gods are wrathful if you disturb them, right? And so that's what you see there, why they had to make an example. And in their perspective, they're correct, though. It is a very big attack on their democracy. They call it our democracy, right? Our democracy is that type of oligarchic system that represents the religious values that they hold dear, which is victimism, using the concern for victims to accumulate power, and doing so in a way that chases off differentiation and boundaries around the globe.
Well, and remember, they set fire to that church across the street from the White House. And to them, that was, you know, that was not a big deal. That was just that was just a protest that may have gone a little bit wild, but hey, it's no big deal. But people trespassing into the Capitol, on the other hand, that's a bridge too far for them. You know, a big a big thing I think that people, you know, especially like Tucker Carlson's audience, and people that have been skeptical this entire time of the narrative that's been put forward by the January 6th committee. I think that we need to remain focused on is the truth. We need to continue pursuing the truth, and it can't be us trying to put together a narrative that we feel comfortable with, but we have to be looking to put together an accurate narrative that depicts the reality of that day. You know, do the exact opposite that the January 6th committee did. Because if we don't do that, then it's just going to be one faction battling the other faction. And the only thing that will be able to unite the factions together I believe it is a truth that depicts the reality that happened that day. You know, at what point did somebody break a window? At what point did somebody cross into an area that they shouldn't have? And there are some other questions that need to be asked. For instance, to what degree, if any, was the FBI involved? To what degree, if any, did the FBI have agents or informers, the people that were on their payroll embedded in the crowd that day?
or other agencies, because there's a whole host of
Yes.
agencies that are not
Well,
related at all to the FBI. So you
Yeah.
can't give them weasel words because that's how they like. You can't even say law, because they asked them one question, was law enforcement involved? And they're like, no, there wasn't. But there's other groups that are agencies that are not law enforcement that have private contract groups. There's a lot of ways they can have a plausible deniability.
Well, and there was that woman. She testified. It was in front of Congress. I don't think it was in front of the January 6th committee, but she was she was head of like domestic terrorism at the FBI. I'm not calling her domestic terrorist. I'm just saying that she was head of the domestic terrorism department at the FBI. But she was being interviewed by the congressmen were asking her questions under oath, and they asked her whether the FBI had informants or agents embedded in the crowd that day. And she said, and what they kept on saying was, her along with many other people, was, well, I can't answer that question because there's an ongoing investigation. And you know as well as you guys know as well as I do that if the answer to that question was no, it wouldn't matter if there was an ongoing investigation or not. She would have said no.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, keep in mind, we don't even have to go that far, into agencies. I mean, both parties were, in support of locking up, these insurrectionists, right? Mitch McConnell, there was another, I forget what his name is, but he said, these people need to be locked up and put in jail. He's another Republican senator. So, they had no problem with, being sort of the, not wanting to get caught up in being punished. So they quickly, made, the Republicans or people, politicians on the Republican side were quick to rebuke or negate, that whole incident, right? So as not to get caught up in the tribunals and the what would come later, you know what I mean? So they didn't want to be attached to that at all, right? So they saw that as taboo, So yeah, go ahead.
Well, and this is the thing is sure, if people trespassed, hold them accountable, but at the same time, when you look at that footage of that QAnon shaman guy, and what the footage looks like is he's being escorted by at least 2 or 3 police officers, through the hallways and things. Now, so somebody could pose the argument and say, well, the police were in fear for their lives, so they were going along with him, they were just kind of going with him, or maybe what the argument would be is that the police were walking with him to make sure he didn't damage any property or something.
Yeah.
Well, the thing, it doesn't really matter. Why wouldn't
they just tackle him down and get him out of there?
Well, exactly. And the thing is, it doesn't really matter what the line of reasoning was for the police officers. What matters is that at least according to that footage, they were accomplices to him. The fact that the fact that their job, they were deputized to stop crimes from happening.
Yeah, if it's a trespass,
right?
If it's a trespass, where have we ever seen a video of police walking with a trespasser through all of the different rooms of a warehouse or wherever they're trespassing? I've never seen that.
Yeah.
I mean, they walked past the 2 security guards and the QAnon shaman walked past like 6 other like SWAT team members or something like that. I mean, it just wasn't something where they thought he was a threat. Either way, it goes. I mean, they obviously didn't see him as a threat. I think he had to say that he was mentally, not mentally
ill.
There. And yeah, he had to say he was mentally ill in order to like get a lesser charge or something like that,
Yeah.
Which in all fairness, I do think he probably was mentally ill just looking at videos of him and stuff from, but the thing is, I think it's a really important point though, because, as far as like that footage goes, and anything that's counterfactual to what the January 6th committee narrative is, the left's the advice that the left has, and the prescription the left is just duck and cover. Don't look at the footage, pretend it's not there, and we need to imprison anybody that looks at the footage, and we need to imprison anybody that was a participant in releasing the footage. So to me, that brings in a whole list of other questions. One is, what right does the government have to keep footage from the people that is not that would not put anyone in direct danger of the footage being released? Because that is the argument for classification of documents, of footage of different things that the government uses. That's the argument that they use to classify material, to withhold it from the public, is that it could harm someone. Well, the thing is, if releasing this footage never would have harmed anybody to begin with, then what was the argument for withholding the footage from the public and continuing to do so? And then what is their argument? What is their legitimate argument for saying that the footage needs to continue to be withheld? There was an article I read in The Hill yesterday morning, and it summed up, I think it quoted Chuck Schumer, or it quoted somebody. It quoted some high-level Democrat in Congress, and what they said was that there were two reasons that the January 6th, that this swath of January 6th footage should have never been released. One is that it would fuel conspiracy theories, and two is that it would put people in danger. Just two broad statements that are not based on any fact. They're not based on any reality whatsoever. They're just excuses, and excuses are not a good enough reason to do anything or to not do anything. You've got to have some legitimate moral reason, or some legitimate practical reason for doing something. It can't just be, oh, I've said a few words and that's enough. No, that may be enough for them. That's not good enough for the rest of us.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that the vast majority of the people at the Stop the Steal rallies that were going on for days were not involved at all with that, and
No.
saw something very disturbing with that. And all human beings are capable of being swept up in the crowd and doing violent acts. You don't need, federal contractors or provocateurs to make people get swept up in doing things that are wrong. Let's be clear about that. For any ideology, any religion, anybody, any IQ, any class, income level, no. When you're in a mob and people, you can feel the energy of aggression and anger, and you can get confused quickly. You can get swept up in a monkey see, monkey do kind of contagion, which is very, very real from an anthropological perspective and just common sense. Growing up, walking by two people fighting, you can feel your adrenaline go up. People talk about mirror neurons. They talk about all kinds of other things. There's a lot of levels to mimesis, and crowds are just not the good thing for that. So I say that as another reminder, and I've told folks who have talked about this January 6th thing that we should not rely on angry crowds to achieve progress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's something I want to be clear about too. I don't care who you are. If you want to talk about you're a trad or conservative, if you believe in getting into an angry protest, you're a liberal. Okay, liberals do that. Liberals do that. Revolutionary spirit, rebel people do that. Okay, if you're for order, if you're for law and order or beauty, you don't get into an angry crowd to get your point across. You just don't. That's not the tactics of people who are winners, who move culture forward. And I just want that to be clear. I'm not condemning to say you're a bad person. I understand it's part of our American thing to do these crowd things. But the crowds have a spirit, that are not compatible with good progress from a Christian standpoint. And Jesus had to get away from crowds. He had to get on a boat, just sail across the lake to get away from them sometimes. And I've always said, if Trump had, instead of doing this stupid thing, and I've told that to the people who were involved with this Stop the Steal thing, when you see the different, there was all kinds of folks who were there for the good part of it, right? And I've said, you know, I'm not condemning your intentions to want to be a part of a healthy part in not being anything involved with the violent stuff, pushing and kicking and whatever. But at the same time, imagine if Trump had had some inkling of performance art and art, instead of doing that Stop the Steal thing and say, hey, let's go show our displeasure with these results and let them know how we're unhappy with them and tell them that they don't have to certify this. What if he had just did a silent protest where they blocked off a few parts of the streets in Capitol building, in the capital city, and Trump just planked, just laid down, prostrated himself in a silent protest, Gandhi style, just prostrated himself with that loud mouth of his, always having something to say, for the one moment in his career where he is in a very, very serious grievance about what has been done to him, for him to be silenced for once with a visual like that and have those cameras, helicopters come around. What in the world is this? They wouldn't know what to say.
Yeah.
And that would have made his movement, if you wanted his movement to be bigger and more powerful, 10 times more exciting, more morally authoritative to this day. But because, think about how much more political, just from one move of a visual of that big man, plank down that little orange, that spray tan and everything, just plank down in silence for a few minutes even. And I have them cameras zooming around. What in the world, And of course, you'd have to have some kind of security to make that happen. But if he were able to pull off something like that visually as they're counting the election and you have the split screen, oh my goodness. Talk about Aikido ninja flipping the aesthetic of the left, of the protest, without having to do the mob violence or the mob spirit, which can easily turn into aggression and mistakes. That one person could have changed it.
Well, there's a movie where Marie Antoinette does that. She bows to the people, but they still chopped off her head, bro. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not. People's.
No, I'm not saying he should have done that with his Stop the Steal people there. They might have attacked him if he did that or something. But yeah, if he had no protest, no rally, no nothing, just him alone, silently protesting, I don't support this, and I'm your American president, and this is my statement. Boom. That's powerful. Don't you see, Shane? I know that's crazy, but Trump's the kind of crazy performance artist that would maybe do something wild like that. But his style is bombastic, WWE style. But to do that one time after all the WWE shenanigans of his whole style for years would have been so powerful that people would still have that visual in their head. And he would have won over so many moderates and centrists to say, man, this speaks volumes, because there's something powerful about visual art. There's something powerful about nonviolent resistance. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be understood, but people don't even have the capacity to want to entertain that because they're so caught up dialectically in beating their rival that they're becoming like it. I tell people that the January 6th thing was mimetic reciprocity to the Summer of Love violence. Yeah. The right said, hey, you get to do it, we get to do something like it, to some degree. Somebody had to have that visceral feeling when they ran in there, start pushing and shoving and kicking and everything, And people were killed in that, and they shouldn't have been killed. And people were thrown away in prison that shouldn't be thrown away in prison. And you know what is another reckoning that we need to think about is how so many of those people are getting decades for sentencing because of conspiracy charges. So for the first time, the MAGA movement, which has been typically tough on crime, has had to reckon with, wait a second, those conspiracy charges is what this guy kicked that guy, this guy punched that guy, this person gets all those charges because he said something like, hey, whatever, slow down or not yet. Now he gets 30 years or 20 years or something. That's the same thing that they've been doing to ruin folks in the drug war for decades. And let's be clear that if a conservative movement is going to have any credibility going forward, They can't play this game of saying lock them up and throw away the key to people who get 34 years, like my friend Rufus Rochelle, who's now home free because of the Trump administration, not the parts of it that want more law and order, tough on crime parts. That's fashionable with the new right, but they don't know anything about the law, right? Because what they have totally, with this January 6th thing, for the first time, they're recognizing, some of them, the dangerous corruption of these conspiracy laws. And so my point is always to try to get both of the mimetic rivals to look at the truth and say, hey, leftists, I'm with you on the conspiracy laws for drug war. And I want to get my conservative friends to join us on that. But let's also be fair and say that that's putting these January 6 people that you've been told to hate into unfair sentencing, where they're being tortured and politically persecuted. They're being tortured. A lot of them are. Solitary confinement, abuse, beatings, naked, stripped down searches every few hours, sleep deprivement. A lot of that stuff's been happening to the January 6 people. A lot of them committed suicide. And a true leftist would say, this is not right, right? And a true conservative should say, hey, you know what? I need to rethink the conspiracy laws for drug war too.
Well, and you know, I think there are people with a deep sense of justice on the left and on the right. And I think you're right, David. I think when you get down to it, what all of them would agree on is that the law should apply to everyone. And it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter how much money you have, and it doesn't matter what ideology you subscribe to. All should be subject to the law. And that is why I think it is so important that all of this footage comes out, so that we can start identifying people that the January 6th committee just decided not to go after. We'll use Ray Epps as an example of that type of person that Ray Epps, for people that don't know exactly what he did. He stood outside of the building and incited people to go and violently enter the Capitol. He stood outside the building, and he was even talking about it the day before. There's cell phone video of him doing that. And the January 6th committee just said, well, there's really nothing to see here with this guy. And like you said earlier, David, oh, this guy's a saint. This guy is an American hero. No, he's not. The guy actually incited the crowd to violence. If what they're calling, if they're calling trespassing violence, of course. But the thing is, I guess what I'm saying is everyone that was an accomplice to this event, the Congress needs to hold everyone to account, including Ray Epps, including anybody that may have been an FBI informant, anybody that would have been on the FBI payroll. And what we need to do is find out who was on the government, find out who was in the crowd, and find out who was on government payroll.
Or private contractor payroll, which is harder to find.
Yeah, but
they probably would say that would violate national security secrets or something.
Yeah, but the problem is if this was an attack on our democracy to the level of which we haven't seen since the Civil War or Pearl Harbor or whatever, then these deep state people should be willing to suspend their little protests about, oh, well, what about this person's civil liberties or that person's civil liberties? Because they really don't care about anybody's civil liberties that they don't ideologically agree with,
Right. Until it affects them, right?
Yeah.
And that's the main thing is that, it's like, we all have to be cognizant of the fact that any one of us can get caught up under the law and get sent to jail, right? That's that's the thing that's scary about the government. You know what I mean? They could put something on you didn't even know you had, right? And throw you under the bus, right? And so, it's like to me, this whole January 6th committee and hearings and everything was, really just, it's like a witch hunt. You know what I mean? We're going to use this as a witch hunt. These people are accountable. We need We need a ritual sacrifice to be carried out. You know what I mean?
Because we need our neighbors to hate each other, you know,
Right.
the middle class, especially, and the poor.
Yes. Yes.
And you know, I think that's the reason that we've got to stand firm on that everyone must be held to account that was there that day. And what I would guess is if the people forced the enforcers to apply the law equally across the board to everybody that was there, you know, and you know, I'm you know, thinking about these Capitol Police that walked right with that shaman dude, you know, down the hallway and things, you know, hold them to account too, you know. And what I would guess is if the enforcers were forced to hold everyone to account, then they'd probably start acquitting people. You know, they'd probably say, well, you know what, we're going to start commuting sentences. You know, we need to back off this a little bit because maybe we've been going a little bit too harsh. But you know what? If they don't want to back down, if they want to start persecuting their own folks, fine. You know what? What I would like to see are exonerations, sentence. I'd like to see commutes of sentences or shortening of sentences. But if that's not an option, then hold everybody to account, hold everyone to the same standard, because that's second best. It is hold everyone uniformly to the same standard. What did Jesus say? The way you treat the least of these, you know? And the thing is, when you treat dispossessed people differently from possessed people, then there's a major problem there. And the problem with a lot of the people that have gotten jail time and all kinds of things, those are people that don't wield any kind of power. They don't have any real connections.
Yeah.
But the people that are the people that haven't been gone after, that were there, that either did things wrong that day or failed to do the right thing, like those police that apparently walked with that shaman guy. You know, they haven't been held to account. In fact, they have been raised to the level of being apostles.
And, you know, let's talk about Roseanne Boylan, one of the persons who was a Trump supporter who died. She was trampled and struck by police repeatedly as she was laying dying. She's 34 years old. I think she was overweight. And it reminded me of the same story. She died right in front of everybody, and she's being beaten, you know, and reminds me of the young lady who unfortunately was struck by a car at the Charlottesville rally. You know what I mean? And that was used as a story of like an emblem of the evil of this movement, right? Of the people that were there for the protest to remove that statue. That this person was a sacred victim who died as a scapegoat, right? As a sacrifice, protesting against their ideology, because it was an attack on the reigning ideology of the new revolutionary movement to displace all recognition of folks like, you know, Robert E. Lee, right? But you see what I mean? That there's two people who are unfortunately killed, and one is treated as a sacred death, and one is treated as you don't hear about it. And if you do hear about it, it's just meant to be another shame on the Trump movement for asking her to come out there. But she was viciously beaten by police, as were others. And I think that should make people pause and reflect on one of the pillars of conservative Inc., which has been back the bootlickers. You know, that whole emblem has to stop. This whole, you know, whatever they want. Now that you should always, I agree with the spirit of you should always obey and respect, you know, police and authorities when they do that. But that doesn't, you know, it goes to this kind of fetishization of police state power, you know, where, you know, people are getting beaten with clubs, and this overweight lady isn't it? It's horrible. You look at the video and you say, dear God. I mean, she's just going blue. People are walking around her, you know, and other stories like that are very haunting. Ashley Babbitt, of course, you know, being shot for no reason. And again, if she was, and they've made the point in Conservative Inc., so I don't like to point it out, but, you know, if she was a BLM protester, right, she would be treated as a martyr to this day, right? As an icon, as a symbol with T-shirts and Hollywood production values and graphics and shrines and remembrance days. But because she was protesting for a blasphemous heresy ideology, which, by the way, does not make it correct. Now, let's be clear about that.
Right.
Just because it's a blasphemy, heretical view of political power in D.C. does not make the MAGA movement, therefore, correct from a Christian standpoint. Christians have to be able to navigate paradox, dealing with these things, or apparent paradoxes. But, you know, because she was there on behalf of an unauthorized person, Trump, you know, who was talking about get the oil if you're going to go into a country. You can't say that. That's heretical. You say, we try to teach them illiteracy. That's why we go to Iraq, you know? We went to Desert Storm. What we did Desert Storm and Iraq won the war because babies were being yanked from incubators, right? The PR firm told us. Turns out that was all a fraud. But that you're supposed to, the number one rule for DC is you're supposed to keep those narratives going at all times with your rhetoric. You don't say we're just going to take the oil. That is to blaspheme the entire project of their statecraft, right? That's the, you know, and so she came in the name of a guy who says that stuff. So therefore her death is considered to be not something to be sorrowful about or thinking about, right?
Yeah.
What'd you say, Shannon? I didn't hear you.
I said you have to keep the narrative of weapons of mass destruction going.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Or that we have to spread democracy in Afghanistan, all this stuff. You can't say, well, just take the oil or whatever. What are we getting out of that? That he was a statist who was not staying on script. He would talk about generic drugs in the midst of a pandemic. You don't do that. You push what your oligarchic masters have given you, and you don't push a product that would ban their emergency use authorization from continuing. That's just a rookie mistake. You know what I'm saying? It is a rookie mistake because he still, to this day, wants to say that those products that he pushed were so good, you know, the authorized products, right? But it's a rookie mistake for him to even mention that there's a generic drug that is not part of the program of the oligarchs that might help you. Please consider it. Give it a shot. You're not allowed to say that. That's blasphemy. You stay on script at all times. And that's why his movement is completely unauthorized. And that's why DC is 100% committed to making sure that someone like him is not allowed in the seat of power again. Because even though he kept the status quo on most things relatively going, his rhetorical statements were so blasphemous and so destructive for the sacred aura of the DC mythology that it was almost critical. And then the move, I mean, you can't make up of a better, but that was their way of trying to get January 6th from the DC's perspective was their attempt to try to get you to see this is what happens when you vote for a person who wants to have peace with Russia. You get this mob, right? You get things that are so traumatic, that are so upsetting for the average American, left or right, who just wants everything to stay relatively pacified.
Yeah.
You know, and they're saying this is what you get if you vote for someone who says normalize relationships with North Korea, Syria, Russia. Our entire American economy and government structure is built on militarism and pharma, to name two. Those are two big gods. Those are big gods in their pantheon, and you just can't talk about them in a way that is destructive to the religion that says whatever big pharma pushes is okay. And not only okay, but necessary for your health, for whatever disease that big pharma is trying to help you with. And the same thing for militarism. Militarism is always done in the name of protecting sacred victims around the world and spreading our values about undifferentiation to those places around the globe. You cannot have somebody up there in power who says, yeah, we're just going to do it and try to get some energy out of it or some. You can't do that. That's blasphemous. That's like someone hiring a Catholic Pope to get up there and say, we're doing the mass as a fundraising drive, guys. Come on, put a little money in our pockets here. This is what we're doing this for. Did you feel good? Did you have a great time? Everybody okay? You know, you're not supposed to say that. You know what I'm saying? That's blasphemy for that religion. And the same thing goes for what Trump was doing. You can't say take a generic when you're supposed to push that. You can't say take the oil, and that's why his movement has completely been persona non grata, and they don't know what to do, right? So that's why they have to have these narratives, and I don't go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it just seems like we have such a short attention span, because if you go back to 2016, it was all about how Russia intervened in our election and stole it and everything. Then after that, you remember the Havana syndrome.
Yeah.
That's something that I think a lot of people have forgotten about.
Yeah.
And they were saying that Russia was attacking our diplomats around the world using supersonic weapons or like sound-based weapons. And then like the other day, the State Department came out and said, well, that was all fake. And remember, we kicked out Russian diplomats as a consequence to our accusations that they were behind the Havana syndrome, when it turned out that these were just like migraines or something that our diplomats are getting because they were obese and had bad diets, like
seed oils.
The thing is, and then you continue down the road to the whole collusion thing and everything, and then that turned out not to be true, and it just seems like they keep trying to provoke Russia to become, in the American mind, the evil other, that legitimizes the neoliberal or neoconservative, which they're both really the same thing. Their rule over us all, and like you said, David, they rule using the pillars of the pharmaceutical industry. They rule using the military industrial complex, going like
Hollywood,
blowing up other people around the world. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you see Sean Penn there. He used to be Mr. Anti-war, anti-imperialism of America. Who paid that boy off?
Yeah, and
who paid that boy off? What movie did he need funding for? Somebody paid that boy off, or had some blackmail and some of them Hollywood parties and God knows what, because that boy is a faithful servant for war.
It was that movie, The Linguist. The Linguist. Remember, he was protecting that
CIA or something.
Yeah, something like, no, he was protecting that girl that she was a linguist in the United Nations or something like that, and he was protecting her from.
Remember when he used to say that he liked Venezuela's guy Chavez and all that?
Yeah, Hugo
Somebody
Chavez.
Somebody sat that boy down, didn't they? They said, "Hey, brother, come on, you've been getting on our nerves, brother."
Yeah.
They said something.
He was advocating for Chad at one time. He was talking about tyranny in Chad and Niger. I'm like, okay,
but he was kind of critical of the DC establishment's, scapegoat narratives, and now he's on board with, whatever you got to do, and that's what you see. The January 6th thing, in some way, is still distracting and taking the oxygen out of the room from what's going on with Ukraine, right?
Yeah,
you're still not allowed to say that. And it's all based on, you notice that the January 6th whole thing is all connected to foreign policy. Notice how all the people who were running the committee were all the biggest brands, like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, for perpetual insurrection, regime change, chaos, all of those different things we saw with the Arab Spring. The politicians who have been front and center for the January 6th insurrection. Why is it that they're all to the T the biggest advocates for foreign regime insurrection? Why? There's something connecting there, right? Pelosi, Cheney, nobody who's anti-war. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't saying throw all the January 6 people in prison. Jimmy Dore, who's anti-war, wasn't saying throw them all in there. Chris Hedges, who's another progressive Democrat, is defending the rights of the January 6 prisoners. It's only the neo-warmongers, like you said, who are the front and center advocates for this event is an attack on our democracy. Why is that? There's something connected between January 6th and the presentation that the media wants us to know about it and the sacredness of our foreign adventures. Do you see that?
Well, I think the connection is probably that in their minds, if you're not willing to bomb poor people overseas for democracy, then your existence is a force against democracy. And that's kind of one common thing, is that Donald Trump, there was a lot wrong with the guy, but I think we can all agree on with regard to foreign policy. He stood for peace. At least he stood for America not getting involved in more wars, America scaling back its existing wars, and America trying to build bridges with those countries that it had major issues with. An example would be North Korea.
And
including the Middle East. I mean, for whatever it's worth. I mean, he did do, something to move those political divisions forward. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of people forget that.
And remember when he said that in that Super Bowl interview, we torture people too, and we take out people too, and kill, and that's
absolutely right.
You're not allowed to say that though. If you're a president, you're elected to be the biggest PR spokesperson for the American empire and its oligarchic interests. That's it. That's your job. And if you don't do that job, you are fired. Or there's different ways they can fire you, and that's the reality of it. And that's the job you're signing up for if you want to do that. And that's why using politics and campaigns can be a place for prophetic critique and revelation about the religion of our culture. But it ultimately is not a place where you can actually, in my opinion, truly effectively create change for Christ as an actual person in governance. I think that's a much more difficult thing, because you're basically saying, I'm applying for a job to be the high priest of a false religion, but I'm going to use that job once I get it to somehow move you towards Christ. That's a little bit weird, right? Like if you were to try to say, I want to be the Church of Satan's president, but I'm going to do it in a way that subverts it and brings you to Christ, and then, imagine what happens when you do that, right? It doesn't work out so well once you've had to perform a couple black masses or whatever in the Church of Satan. Now you kind of got stuck with that stuff. You know what I mean? That's the problem. That's the problem with politics, and all those little people who want to be little Caesars on the right. They haven't recognized that yet, because they don't know what it means to follow Jesus yet.
Pizza.
That's what I call them, my little Caesars, the little Caesars.
Well,
little seed oil Caesars.
And just kind of backing up, I think that I think January 6th, probably in 15, 20 years down the road, when January 6th is about as far away from us as like 9/11 is now. I think people will end up looking back and saying, and pointing out, it's really interesting that the national security state that was beefed up after 9/11 via the Patriot Act and everything under the Bush administration, and it was really in its infancy, during the Bush administration. Then it was really built out during the Obama administration. And the whole argument, the entire time, they were saying, oh, no, this is not being used, and it will not be used domestically against American citizens, because they're not the threat. They're not the terrorists. It's Muslims or it's Russians or it's Chinese or something. But it's not American citizens. Don't worry about that. Then the Trump administration, Donald Trump was hostile toward the national security state. Whether you like the guy or don't like the guy, he was hostile toward the national security state, because he was a civil libertarian. Then January 6th happens, and the national security state changed its direction. Rather than looking outward and monitoring communications from within and without the country, and communications abroad, they use that as the excuse to completely pivot and turn their attention domestically. They're saying that the greatest threats to American security are Americans now.
It's no wonder that the Attorney General Merrick Garland, he had a dry run at this narrative when he was working with Clinton during the Oklahoma City bombing. As we know, that event was used by Merrick Garland and others at the time who were involved with dealing with that as a narrative to discredit the burgeoning right-wing so-called patriot movement that was distrustful of government and was very populist, that had appealed to folks, with Ross Perot. Remember that just happened? That was scary for the establishment to see a guy come out and create that kind of crossover populist appeal. And they they unfortunately, we still don't know what happened to Terrence Yeekey. Thank God somebody with a conscience at the New York Times apparently has just done a story about Terrence Yeekey, who was a African-American police officer in Oklahoma City, who was one of the first to arrive on the scene in the bombing. And he was a hero for saving many people, but what he saw deeply disturbed him. And he went on to independently try to investigate certain things. And he was found out to be allegedly suicided. He was found half a mile from his car. There was lots of blood in his car, and he had multiple stab wounds on his arms and everything and hands. And he had a gunshot to the head, but he had done that a half a mile away from his car where his blood was found in the car. It was ruled as a suicide. No autopsy to this day was done. The Oklahoma City police was called in to do the investigation of his death, and that was outside of the jurisdiction where his body was found. So that's Merrick Garland, okay? That's Merrick Garland. Talk about Black Lives Matter. I want to know what happened to Terrence Yeekey, because his family deserves justice, and we need to have T-shirts with Hollywood-style graphics with Terrence Yeekey's face, because what he did, he knows something, and we need to know what Merrick Garland knew and what we need to know. And the New York Times, for some reason, got ahead of the story. Maybe that was a limited hangout where they released a story just this week or last week about Terrence Yeekey, this cop who died under mysterious circumstances. But that Oklahoma City bombing thing, children were murdered in that, okay? Children, little kindergarten kids were killed in that. And that was used as a narrative to say the right-wing movement is dangerous and it's terroristic. And it was used to try to discredit people who were upset with what Clinton had done with Ruby Ridge. You know what I mean? Excuse me, Ruby Ridge and Waco, right? The Waco thing where they bulldoze kids and set them on fire there. American citizens, and the conservative right-wing movement was up in arms about that. And there was militias and things like that were popular in the 90s, and they had to discredit public outcry against Waco attacks that Clinton had done. And they used the Oklahoma City bombing narrative about why that happened. They pinned it on right-wing extremism. And now Merrick Garland back again saying, this January 6th thing is a reason why white supremacists are the biggest threat to our democracy. And isn't it interesting that their scapegoat du jour is always a projection of the very thing that they have been found to be financing? With the war on terror, they kept saying, if you question our wiretapping, you are an enabler of Islamic radical terrorists. Remember that? They would say that to Ron Paul and people like that. Turns out they were funding al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and ISIS all over the Middle East, while they were calling people who criticized them doing that Islamic terrorist enablers. What are they doing now? If we criticize their garbage lies about why we need to have nuclear war with Russia, we're called white supremacists, right? While since 2014 or even before, McCain, Graham, and all those folks, Newland, have been funding, arming, training, radicalizing, and equipping the Azov Battalion, a white supremacist group. Isn't that funny how their narratives work? Whatever group that they end up funding, they seem to be really good experts about, and they like to make sure that anybody who says, please stop doing that, we want to live in peace, they say, well, you're this group. Because it's like they get fixated on something, and they want to project their sin onto whoever criticizes them for their sin. Isn't that interesting? It's almost diabolical, isn't it? It's almost Satan does. That's almost exactly what Satan does.
Now they put the sin on the traditional Catholics, those of us who like to go to, the Roman Latin Mass, you know what I mean? So.
Well, that might be a sign that they're planning to fund some radical Latin Mass group around the world for some new crusade, new campaign. Whenever group they demonize usually is the one they want to really, support overseas, at least,
Well, and that's the fascinating thing is Merrick Garland, the first group he really persecuted after January 6th were parents that were upset at school board meetings because like the one guy in Virginia, his daughter had been sexually assaulted in a bathroom at her high school, and it turned out that school district in Virginia had been covering up sexual assaults in bathrooms of young girls, and this father was outraged, and there was a whole string of outraged parents all at the same time, and Merrick Garland went after those parents, started investigating them and everything. And then about a year or two later, then this memo from the FBI leaks that they're investigating Catholics, and that they plan on infiltrating Catholic dioceses, so that they can start monitoring them. Who knows? But the thing is, this stuff should be off limits completely. Defining American citizens as being the enemy, that should be completely off limits. And that I at least a glance over the Constitution, it looks like that should be prohibited for the federal government to go after American citizens as being the enemy, unless they've committed a legitimate crime.
Right. Or at least, not to label a whole group,
I've got to run. I want to, next time I wanted to talk about it today, but next time we can maybe pick this up, and I want to pivot in contrast to what we've talked about today with what happened and what did mobs do in Jesus's day or in earlier pieces of history, when they would storm a Capitol building or a shrine or a temple. What would happen to those mobs when they got caught? And what would they do before they got caught to the people that they would, because I want to examine the difference between the ethics of our time versus the ethics in the pre-Christ world, right? And I also would like to look at how Jesus dealt with the temple of his time. What was he doing with the cleansing of the temple? What was that all about? There's a lot of different interpretations as to what he was up to with that. And I think it'd be interesting to reflect on what Jesus was doing in his actions at the temple, and also the 70 AD, the destruction of the temple that happened after that. What were the connections between what Jesus did there and what happened in 70 AD? So maybe we can pick that up next time and talk about some of those things. What do you think?
Sounds great to me, David.
Thank you, guys. Again, check out brightnews.com, where Shannon Braswell is the curator and podcaster. You can also see their content, Bright News Media, on YouTube, all one word. Type that in and you'll find their channel, where you can subscribe there and see Shane and Shannon's podcast that they do there. And thanks, Shane, for joining me as well.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys.